Okay. So welcome to this session on the Simple Estimator. It's going to just be a quick overview of the estimator. There will be training on the estimator offered later if there's interest in doing that. And I'll check with folks towards the end of this to see if there is interest in training. I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. And let's see, where do I want to go? Show all windows. Okay. Can folks see that okay? My PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth a little bit between this PowerPoint and the spreadsheet. And a Word document in the web and so forth. I'll try to, hopefully folks will be able to hang with me here. Again, just a reminder to please mute. If you have a clarifying question, it's okay to unmute and ask it, but for most questions, I'd prefer you put them in the chat box or hold on to them until the end. If there's something really urgent that you don't understand, like I said, you can unmute and jump in, or you can use, there's a clap feature. We'll use that for the raise hand feature. I think I see that when somebody uses it. If okay with you, I'd like you to put your email address in the chat box so we can do a follow-up survey. Make sure I'm doing my job. Please remember to mute. This session is being recorded. We'll convert it to YouTube and then put it in the manual within the next couple of days here. I can stay on past 10 if there are questions. So I've scheduled it for an hour, but I can hang on if there are any questions. So I'm going to just quickly talk about what the estimator is, go through the structure of the estimator, inputs in the summary tab, do an example calculation, a simple one, talk about some of the limitations, go through where the guidance is and how you can download it, and then we'll have hopefully plenty of time for some Q&A session. Now the estimator was built back for the 2013 permit. A lot of permittees didn't want to learn how to use models like P8 and WinSlam, so we put together a real simple spreadsheet. It became apparent that over time that folks wanted to use it for a little bit more than what we had intended it for, so we've expanded it fairly significantly. And so now it's, I suppose if we were to rename it, would be the mostly simple estimator.
I need to put them up high somewhere, maybe?
Remember to mute, please. So the estimator is an Excel spreadsheet. It allows a user to calculate total phosphorus and TSS load reductions associated with the implementation of best management practices. It's built on the simple method, and it can be used to meet permit requirements. One of the limitations I'll talk about later is we certainly don't recommend that you use it to model your system. It's not a P8, it's not a WinSlam, it's not an XP Swim model by any means. So I am going to go through the basic structure and inputs and so forth in the estimator. Everybody see my spreadsheet?
No.
Can't see the spreadsheet, huh? Yeah, sometimes this screen sharing thing gets really weird. Folks see it now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, about the time I get all this technology stuff down, they'll be sending this back to the office and I'll forget it all in about 2 days. But okay, So here is the simple estimator spreadsheet. I'll show you where you can download later. There's an information tab here. It doesn't have a whole lot of information, just some text about what the cells mean in the estimator. And there are some links here that you can use, but there's links embedded throughout the estimator too. So you'll notice on the bottom there are 10 area tabs, is what we call them, areas 1 through 10. It allows you to model up to 10 different areas, subwatersheds, whatever it is you want to call them. There's a summary sheet where everything is compiled, all the results. There's a worksheet where you can basically, it's an open spreadsheet that you can work examples and calculations and so forth if you need to, and then a notes page. You'll notice that the notes section on these individual tabs is pretty small, so if you have fairly detailed notes, you can stick them in the notes page. Working off some notes here, so we'll start with all the area tabs are the same. Areas 1 through 10 are exactly the same. So I'll just go through one of them. There are 5 sections on each of these area tabs. Section 1 is what we call the unadjusted total load. Section 2 is an adjusted total load. Section 3 is where you do your phosphorus load reductions with BMP's implementation. Section 4 is for TSS. And Section 5 just holds the default values in the estimator in case you need to go back and refer to those. If you look at the tabs, there are 4 different colors. The gray tabs you cannot edit, but they're just information tabs. The red tabs you cannot edit. These are calculation tabs. These are places where calculations are made. The yellow tabs are places that you can modify, but if you were to modify a value, you'll get an alert box that pops up. It doesn't stop you from doing anything. It's just an alert box that lets you know and lets us know if we were to look at this that some value has been changed. The white tabs are open tabs where you can make changes. You'll notice at the top here you can put a name in, and you can rename your subwatershed if you want. You'll see links embedded throughout here. This link will take you to they all take you to the stormwater manual, except for the precipitation one, which goes someplace else. But for phosphorus event mean concentrations, if you were to click on that tab. Are folks seeing the website, the web page?
Yes.
Okay, so that would take you to information on event mean concentrations for phosphorus. Same for TSS, EMC.
Oh, surveyor.
Please mute. Thank you. Runoff coefficients. The annual precipitation one takes you to an external site where you can get precipitation information for your city or your nearest city or whatever it is you want. Okay, so let's start with section 1. It's called an unadjusted total load. So this is the total load for this area, whatever this area is. It could be a sub-watershed. It could be just a watershed area to a particular best management practice. I suppose it could be your whole city. It's whatever you define this area 1 to be. And so these are going to be the inputs for that particular area. You'll see that there's default land uses. The one thing to remember is you have to have some value in the area. Otherwise, you're going to get errors in the computations because there's division by these values. So by default, there's a very, very low acreage in there, which is essentially 0. It won't affect your calculations. So don't zero that area out, because if you do, you're going to get an error. You'll have to go back and put something in there, some dummy value. So the unadjusted total loads is just the raw load of phosphorus and TSS with no best management practices, no street sweeping, no bioretention, nothing. It's just a starting point for total load. The event mean concentrations are coming out of the stormwater manual. We did a pretty extensive review about a year ago to modify these values. And so they are the default values in here. You can change the yellow, as I mentioned, it'll pop up an alert box. So just for an example, let's put in 1 acre of commercial and 1 acre of residential. And you can see here that the calculations are made, and we've now got a phosphorus load and a TSS load. And we also compute the runoff volume here too, off on the right. Remember to mute, please. Thank you. So again, you can change these values for event mean concentrations and runoff coefficients. You could also change those values down here in what we call the adjusted total load. So if I were to decrease my residential event mean concentration, please mute, please mute. I don't want to have to mute everybody.
Round up and make sure that they.
Please mute your speakers.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm going to have to go in and mute everybody, and I don't want to do that.
You know, like notice and see where they're at.
Yeah.
I was like, maybe we just don't even bother with it.
Might have to do that, Mike.
Park on the road,
Yeah, I mean, that's an option too.
we'll have to walk up though.
I'm getting some feedback from Tom Johnson, it looks like, possibly. Please mute your,
They'll be talking about it on the way back to Twin
All right.
Cities tonight.
Sure, well,
are we good? I really don't want to mute everybody because this is going through the calculator. I realize there's going to be a lot of questions. And I really want people to have the option of interrupting me if they have a clarifying question. Okay. All right, we'll go back here now. So I changed the residential number to 0.3, and you'll see my load here will change, and I'll get an alert box that pops up saying I changed my event mean concentration. You may have very good reasons for changing it, and it's okay to do that. So what is the adjusted total load? That's section 2. This is where we go in and we add things generally going to be associated with non-structural best management practices. We don't have removal values for those in the manual or anyplace else. So if you did street sweeping, for example, and you calculated, well, if I did street sweeping and I think it drops my event mean concentration in residential areas to 0.27 instead of the default of 0.33, you can see that you can make that change and it will show you what your load reduction is associated with that particular change. So I'm getting a reduction of 0.1 pounds for that 1 acre of residential area by street sweeping in this case. And I might want to put a note over here saying I did sweeping. I could also put that in the notes section if I wanted to do something more elaborate and explain what type of sweeping change I made or did to account for that value. In some cases, let's go back up here. Let's add an acre of agricultural land. In some cases, you're actually going to see increases in your adjusted total load. So for agricultural land, let's say I converted it to residential. I want to drop my EMC to 0.33. I'm going to work with just phosphorus here. The things would be the same for sediment, but my runoff coefficient is going to go up. So in this case, you can see I've actually increased my phosphorus load by converting from agriculture to residential, but this is prior to any best management practices other than the non-structural practices. So this will now give me an adjusted load based on those non-structural practices. And like I said, if you have clarifying questions, please ask them.
This MPCA.
Here, this is a good time to ask those clarifying questions.
I just pull up this.
Mike,
MPCA.
this is Sean
I just pulled
Tracy.
this
I've got a
MPCA,
question for you real quickly.
Yep.
Whatever thing. We got somebody working through a spreadsheet on it. Doesn't it look like I'm doing
Someone's
something?
still not on
Yeah,
mute.
please, I really don't want to keep asking people to mute. Everybody, please mute your microphones unless you have a clarifying question. Thank you. All right, I'm sorry, Sean, go ahead.
No worry, Mike. I'm curious about the load calculation per acre. Is the tool simply applying the EMCs to the entire runoff prediction, or is it taking a subset of the total runoff, something like the first inch, and applying the EMCs to that? Otherwise, if it's not, it would be overestimating the total load production by the watershed and potentially influencing the removal efficiency of the BMP.
Yeah, the estimator does both. And so where we're going to get to the treatment is down in section 3. So in the case of sections 1 and 2, it's applying the EMC to all of the runoff. And so that's giving you your base loading before you put any structural practices in. Now, you mentioned that if you capture that first inch, you're going to treat about 90% roughly, give or take, of that runoff. And that's going to happen down here in section 3.
Mike, I guess let me clarify. If you have the total runoff coming from a watershed and you apply EMCs to all of that runoff rather than just the first inch, wouldn't you be over predicting the amount of watershed load coming off?
No, that's the total load coming off the watershed. So what's going to happen? Let's just, for example, let me go through section 3 a little bit, and I hope that maybe gets at your question. So
Sure.
So let's look at this
Mike?
residential. Yep.
This is Randy. Just a clarification on this. You're applying the EMC to the runoff after you use the runoff coefficient. So the
Correct.
EMC is not applied to all the runoff. It's just applied to the runoff that's estimated. I suppose that's all the runoff, isn't it? Because
Right.
that's what the runoff coefficient's for.
Right. It's applying the EMC to all of the runoff from that area. The runoff is calculated based on the runoff coefficient. And so you can see the runoff coefficients are going to change by land use, obviously. So yes, it's the total runoff coming off of the landscape. So to get to Sean's question, so now you look, for example, let's look at this agricultural area. Now we increased our phosphorus load because our runoff coefficient jumped way up. But let's say when we converted, we actually put the whole area into bioretention. So now I would go down, this is in section 3. Here's where you put the acreage associated with these best management practices in. So let's say I put that entire 1 acre into bioretention. Now you go down and you'll see that I've reduced my total pounds from that agricultural area by almost 21%. So here's where I'm getting my gain in pounds. Now this is the tricky part here. Here's this number, and this is what Sean's getting at. This 0.9, these are the default fraction of annual runoff treated by that best management practices. And we have default values of 0.9 in here, except for constructed ponds and wetlands, where we're assuming all of the runoff from the area is being treated by that BMP. We're assuming that 90% of the runoff is being treated by that best management practice. If you're doing mids, that number might be 0.91. If you're undersized in your practice, it might be 0.8. So you might need to go in and change these, but we have a default value of 0.9, meaning that we're assuming 90% of the runoff coming off these sections 1 and 2 of this estimator is being treated by this practice. Now we have 1 acre in agricultural that wasn't agricultural land, we converted it to residential. If I want to put 2 acres of bio retention in, I can't do that, obviously. I can't put 2 acres of bio retention in a 1 acre area. I can put more than 1 acre of BMP in an area. So let's say I had a green roof in that area, a 0.1 acre green roof. I've got 1.1 acres of BMPs in an area that's 1 acre in size, but that's because it's okay to route a green roof to a bioretention. You do get an alert here saying, hey, your BMP acreage is exceeding your land use acreage. Are you sure that's what's happening here? So we might have swales throughout the entire area feeding these bioretention systems, and that's okay. So getting back to these 3 values down here, here's the efficiency, removal efficiency for that practice. Biofiltration, we're giving a removal efficiency of 44%, assuming you're following the guidance in the stormwater manual. Let's go over to a sand filter. Let's put a sand filter in the agricultural area. And we're assuming a 47% reduction in phosphorus for the sand filter. Well, my sand filter is an iron enhanced sand filter. I'm getting 80%. Well, then you would have to go in and change that default value to 80%. And you can see that you get more reduction in phosphorus by putting that iron enhanced system in. Finally, there is this fraction of annual runoff that is infiltrated. If you put a biofiltration system in with an underdrain, there's always leakage below the underdrain. We're assuming that that leakage is 20%. With infiltration practice, you're getting all of the water that's captured. The 90% of the annual runoff is infiltrating. So 90% of the annual runoff is infiltrating. So these are 3 values that you may have to look at fairly closely as you model your system. Is my BMP removal efficiency, is that better or worse than what the default is? Am I treating more than 90% or less than 90%? Have I lined my bioretention system? If I've lined my bioretention system, I'm not getting any infiltration, and you'd have to change that value to 0. So these are all of the BMPs, and you can see we got bioretention, infiltration, filter strip, green roofs, permeable pavement with an underdrain, sand filter, swales, wet basins, wetlands, and we do give you the option of adding a BMP if you want. Section 4 is exactly the same, but it's for TSS rather than total phosphorus. And I've been working only with the phosphorus numbers here. So if I remember right, I had 1 acre of commercial. So I want to put in 0.2 acres of bioretention. You'll see I get a reduction. If I remember right, I had residential. I want to put in infiltration system across half of the acreage that's contributing to that. And I get reduction here associated with that. Section 5 is just a placeholder. If I went up and I changed my runoff coefficient somewhere along the line, and later on I go, whoops, I didn't want to do that. What was that number again? I can go down here to section 5 and see that it was 0.71. So this is where all the default values are. You can't change anything down here. It's just the information section where you can go back and reference everything. And you can see that there are links to everything. This link will take you to the bioretention section in theory. Yep, actually it works. It's always nice when things work. So these will take you to green roof, permeable pavement, and so forth. This will take you to information on runoff coefficients, event mean concentrations, and so forth. So I've done all my entries. What does it look like? If I go to my summary sheet, you can see that it summarizes for each of the 10 worksheets. I've only entered data into worksheet 1, so nothing shows up here. Again, to avoid nonsensical computations, you need very small default acreages. Otherwise, you're going to get error messages returned. And you can see that, ignore the TSS because we didn't do anything with it, but you can see that my phosphorus, my initial load was 1.98. I did some street sweeping to adjust, or I did something to adjust it. I put some BMPs in, that's right. And I got a 10.7 pound reduction in phosphorus, 10.7% reduction, or 0.21 pounds. My initial loading rate was 0.66 pounds per acre, and my final loading rate is 0.59 pounds per acre. If I had done anything in worksheets 2 through 10, those would show up here also. If I'm interested in what I've done with individual BMPs, I can look and I can see I've got 2.2 acres of bioretention, 0.5 acres of infiltration, and 1 acre of sand filter. You can't do anything down here. These are just the alert checks, but if you're interested in seeing, well, what changes did I make from default values, you can go down here and see that. It's also something that we might look at if you were to submit this or we were to look at it during an audit. Obviously, if we looked at this during an audit and there was red changed in every single box here, we might turn to you and say, okay, what's happening here? So the next thing, at this point, let me stop real quick and see if there are any questions before I go through an example. Any questions?
I've got a question for you, Mike. This is Randy.
Okay.
When you say 2.2 acres of biofiltration, you mean that the user has 2.2 acres of land that drain to biofiltration BMPs. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep. So sorry about that. This is the acreage, the area being treated by the best management practice. So it's so in this case, 0.5 acres of that 1 acre in residential area are draining to an infiltration system. There was another question, I believe somebody was going to ask.
There's a whole bunch of questions in the chat.
Okay, do you want me to check I can check on that. Might be nice to look at it. Let's do that before we get into the example here. A lot of folks out there, that's good. In the stormwater manual, the estimator had 3 levels for residential, low, medium, high. That made sense. Now there appears to be only a single residential value. Instead of what, I'm assuming that is why. We didn't feel our lit review provided enough information to support default values for low, medium, and high residential. You can put those into the estimator. If you remember the estimator, I'm going to quickly go back. I don't want to hit end. I'm going to quickly go back to the estimator here. Hopefully you're seeing my screen. And you can see user specified values. So you could put low density res here, and then you could put in your own values. The manual does have guidance about what those values might be. We don't have default values. We just didn't feel there was enough information in the literature to support default values. Oops, let me see. I'm gonna stop share. Okay. Apparently it defaults to the bottom of the questions here. Is the transportation land used for highways and major arterials? If yes, what should we do with the land for residential streets? Yes, in the manual, if you were to go to the manual for the sections on event mean concentrations, you will see that there are individual sections for the different land use, and there's a definition of what those land uses are. And the short answer to this question is yes, this would be for major transportation corridors. The land in residential areas, the streets would be part of the residential land use. What level of subwatershed is the MPC expecting? We don't really have expectations here. It's whatever you feel is best in your system. I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end. One of the deficiencies in the estimator is it does not handle treatment trains. So if you have a treatment train, several bioretention systems going to a regional pond, we might suggest that you model the regional pond as a separate subwatershed, rather than having those bioretention systems and the pond all in one, because your bioretention is giving some treatment. The EMCs going into your pond are going to probably not be accurate. You can adjust those EMCs if you want within the area tab, or you can treat your individual BMPs as separate subwatersheds if you want. And even though there's only 10 tabs on the spreadsheet, there's nothing to limit you from using 10 different versions of the spreadsheet if you wanted to do that. So you could model subwatershed A in your city using one spreadsheet. You could open up a brand new spreadsheet to model a different subwatershed that's got multiple BMPs. How do we estimate the load for an area in a city for a given baseline year? Do we have to estimate the load with no BMPs and then subtract the load reduction? The answer to the question is, yeah, we would recommend that you estimate the load with no best management practices, and then go ahead and put in the practices that you feel were in place for the baseline year in the adjusted load. So the unadjusted load would be no BMPs. We'd recommend you go in for the baseline and put in your BMPs either in the adjusted or in the best management practices section. Do we provide guidance for suggested EMCs for the adjusted total load? In some cases we do. For example, in residential areas, we talk about how some of modifications you can make to EMC based on some practices that you put in. Basically, when we felt there was information in the literature that supported how you could adjust an event mean concentration, we include that information in the manual. Not in all cases, though. As always, if folks have questions, you can always contact me too. My contact information will be at the end of the session today. Is the calculator applying EMCs to the total runoff? So I think I answered this question from Sean. Yes, and then you adjust in sections 3 and 4 based on the practices that you have in place. How we know what acreage to put in section 1. That really is kind of up to the individual entity, the city or whatever that's doing this. I would suggest mapping out your area first. It could be in GIS. It could be just a rough, whatever tool you have. Know your area prior to using the estimator and map it out. Let me give you an example from the manual here. Just to make sure folks can still hear me okay, right? See my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me go right here. And so I scroll way down to the bottom of the page. There's an example on this page. And so this is an example where you might map out an area and divide it up into different land uses. So we'd recommend doing that before you jump into the estimator. Know your area, know how you want to divide it up, and then go in and do your acreages that way. Okay. I see wetlands are a BMP in the section. How many of the city's stormwater go to wetlands or ponds that were historically wetlands or ponds that may have been included in the TMDL study? Is the intention of this column would be only filled out? It really is supposed to only be a constructed stormwater wetland. This gets into the whole waters of the state issue. It's supposed to be a pond or wetland that was constructed or designed for treating stormwater. Historically, if it's been used as for treatment for 50 years, I would maybe suggest go ahead and use it, but and put it in section 3 or 4. You might want to make a note that it's a wetland that was actually historically a natural wetland or whatever, and it's now been kind of converted or being used for stormwater treatment. I don't know if that answers the question, hopefully. Do you have estimated removal rates for iron enhanced sand filters? The answer to that is yes. So if you were to click on the sand filter link in the estimator, it should take you to a page that hopefully will answer that question. We do have removal rates for iron enhanced sand filters. If the user makes changes to various parameters, are there places to enter notes in the spreadsheet for each and all of the changes? Yes, I would use the notes tab in the estimator spreadsheet to make those changes. Just make sure that it's linked to the correct tab where the note where the changes are made, or where you want us or yourself to reference. Make sure it's referenced properly is what I'm getting at. What are the differences in default values and end results between using the estimator and the MIDS calculator? Will the same drainage areas and BMPs entered in an estimator have very similar pollutant removal results as the MIDS calculator? Well, that's a good question. I actually haven't run the two scenarios side by side. Over the years, I've noticed that the manual might have 3 or 4 different pollutant removal efficiencies for a BMP. We've tried to clean those all up and get consistency between all of the tools and the manual that we're using, the MIDS calculator, the estimator, and the manual. So the short answer to this is, I hope they're the same, but that's a good exercise. I'll run it, and hopefully they're in the ballpark.
Mike, this is Bob Bean.
Yep.
Bar did a study on that previously when we were looking at these. And I think that would be a place to start, is to take another look at those papers. I feel like it was a 20-page document that Bar put together, running examples on these already. And maybe if Greg Wilson's on here, he can speak to that.
Bar did do that, and they did it for P8 and WinSlam, comparing it to the MIDS calculator. I don't believe any comparisons have been done between the estimator and the MIDS. I may have done them, and it's ancient history in my mind now, as are most things. So I can go back and see if I've actually made these comparisons between the MIDS calculator and the estimator. If not, I'll do a couple runs and to see what they come out as. But also, Bob, when Bar did that, there were still some discrepancies in removal efficiencies throughout the calculator, the manual, and so forth. And we've tried to go back and get those cleaned up and consistent. So in theory, everything should be pretty close now. I answered this question for Randy. Could you please show the summary tab again? Yes, I can go through that. I'd like to see how the reductions are displayed year after year. Well, they don't do it on a time basis. So if you were going to do this from one year to the next, you would probably use multiple spreadsheets. So you would use a spreadsheet one year, copy that, put a date on it, and then use the same spreadsheet the next year, but give it a new name with a new date. So it doesn't actually look at comparisons from year to year. But I can go over the summary tab again when I go through an example. Is there a cumulative quantity reduction section? Yeah, so I'll quickly go back. Well, let me go ahead and do that real quick again here. If I go back, so if I go to the summary sheet, you'll get results for each area, each tab. So there are 10 tabs, and then at the bottom here, it sums them all up. But like I said, it doesn't do it for year to year. You would have to use the spreadsheet one year, put a date on that, save the file, put a date on it, then use the same sheet the next year, use the file and put a date on that, and then compare the two that way. We could potentially set this up to do that. I wouldn't be really eager about it. Getting to my age, I'm in a point in my career now where I really try not to learn anything new if possible. Especially if it involves technology. Where would stormwater retention pond values be entered in the estimator? And it looks like the last question. So what I'll do is I'll go back and show that. So in the area 1 tab, that would be a wet basin. So these are constructed ponds and these are constructed wetlands. But as the question pointed out, some wetlands are actually not constructed, but they've been used for stormwater treatment. So I'm going to do a quick example here. I've kind of done that already, but this is going to be a little bit more involved than what I've done. Let's see, I've changed some values here. See if I can clear all of this stuff. First, I forget what the default was for agriculture. Let me go back. Go back and check the agricultural defaults 0.11, and hopefully that will clear this out. We'll start with a clean sheet. All right, good. Okay, so for this example, and unfortunately I can only show one screen at a time, but let's go ahead and say we have, so again, if I'm going to start all over, don't put a 0 in here. You need to have a very small, oh, I actually put a correction in. That's great. Sometimes I actually do things without knowing I did them. So 1 acre, for this example, we got 1 acre of commercial, 1 acre of industrial, 1 acre of park. We're gonna put that really low number in for residential because I have 2 residential areas, one with high tree canopy coverage and one with low tree canopy coverage. So let's go with residential high canopy. And it'd be nice if I could spell right. And so we're going to give this a pretty high event mean concentration. I'm only going to work with phosphorus. And the runoff coefficient we're going to say is the same as it is for any residential area. But now I got a residential with a low canopy coverage. And I think my event mean concentration there is pretty low. We're going to go with, say, 0.25. I've also got 1 acre of transportation. That's just for simplicity. Hopefully your area is not 10% major highways, 1 acre of mixed land use or multi-use, and then 1 acre of agricultural land. Is that everything? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, that's right. We got to put in acreages for these here. Okay. So we have 8 total acres in this area. And I get a load here. I've got a phosphorus load of 6.38 pounds. And like I said, we're just going to work with phosphorus for now. This is my unadjusted load. No changes to that. So now in my high canopy area, I'm going to street sweep, and I'm going to drop that phosphorus event mean concentration to 0.3. And you can see that I have, whoops. Anybody know what mistake I just made?
You applied it to residential, not residential high canopy.
Right, okay. So, and hopefully most of you would pick that up when you looked at it and go, why didn't I get any phosphorus reduction? So, yep, I'm going to street sweep in my high canopy area. So now I've got 6.19 pounds phosphorus. I've reduced my load by 0.19 pounds. I am in my commercial area. I'm going to put in a rooftop disconnection practice, which we don't have credits for down here in section 3. And that's going to decrease my runoff coefficient in the commercial area. And I'm going to change that to 0.5. Again, I'm getting phosphorus reduction. I'm going to convert my agricultural area to a mixed land use. So my vent mean concentration is going to go down to 0.29, which is the default for mixed, but my runoff coefficient is going to jump up to 0.5. And you can see that now I've got an annual increase in phosphorus loading. But these are adjusted. I've gotten a reduction for my street sweeping, and I've gotten a reduction for my rooftop disconnection. Now I've got to go in and add the BMPs that I want to add. So let's start with that agricultural area. I put in infiltration across 50% of the area. So I've got 1 acre, 50% of 1 acre would be a half of an acre. In my industrial, yep.
Can you go back just a little bit here? Is there a reason why you're changing the phosphorus and the runoff rather than changing the area, saying that, hey, instead of an acre of agricultural, now I've got like 0.2 and then add more towards the canopy, or are those grays not edible?
The grays are not edible. Yep.
Okay.
You could do that in theory. It just seems a little more complicated to do that. Also, it probably would have required me to do some extra coding. So usually the reason things don't get done in here is because I tend to be on the lazy side and do as little as possible.
All right, thanks.
So now in the industrial area, we've got an iron enhanced sand filter. And we got 50% of the area in that. Does anybody, so it's an iron enhanced sand filter. What else do I need to do? Anybody?
Change the EMC removal efficiency.
Yep. Change that. It's an iron enhanced sand filter that's actually functioning the way it's supposed to. We're going to bump that up to 80% removal of phosphorus, which is what the manual says you should get for a properly functioning iron enhanced system. In residential, we're going to put in 25% of the area in biofiltration, so I won't make the same mistake twice. 25% of 1 acre is 0.25. And finally, in my transportation area, I have swales throughout my entire transportation area. And let's go over here and find transportation. And it's 100%. And of course, if I forget that this is not in percent, it's an acreage, it's going to say, whoops, you can't do that. 100% of 1 acre is 1 acre. So now I've got my reductions associated with each of those BMPs. I'm happy, everything's done. I'm just gonna really quickly go into area 2 and add an acre of commercial land. And I'm gonna put a bioretention system there, just so that we have something to show on the summary sheet. So I'm happy with this. Again, ignore the TSS, we weren't working with TSS. But my worksheet 1, I've got 8 acres of land. My initial loading is 6.38 acres. My final load is 4.98 acres. I'm sorry, pounds, for a reduction of about 22%. 1.4 pounds reduced. My initial loading rate was 0.8 pounds per acre per year. And now I'm down to 0.62 pounds per acre per year. You can see that I now have acreage in that second tab associated with that commercial area. I went down here. This summarizes all of the practices that I've got. So I've got 1.5 total acres in biofiltration systems. You remember I've got 0.25 in each of the residential areas in area 1, and then 1 acre in area 2 in that commercial area. So it just sums them together. So if you're trying to meet the South Metro TSS loading rate, you're going to want to look at the pounds per acre per year, and that would be TSS. If you're looking at, well, I'm trying to get a 20% reduction in my TMDL, you'd be looking at this column. If you're looking at, I need to reduce my phosphorus loading by a pound, you would be looking at this column. So hopefully it addresses the TMDL, the different ways that TMDL waste load allocations can be expressed. I will stop sharing here now and see if there are any additional questions. What if you have a mix of iron enhanced and non in a drainage area? I have a few ways. Well, so some of this is art and not science. So there are a couple different ways you could address that. And I'm not saying any of them is the right way. You could model those that are iron enhanced and those that aren't in separate areas. You could come up with a different removal rate that's a compromise between the two. You could put the iron enhanced sand filters in that other category that's on that spreadsheet. If you remember, if I go back, if you go back here into area 1, you'll see that I can add another. I could add the iron enhanced treatment there. So there are a couple ways you could deal with it. I wouldn't say that any of them is great, but those are some options. Is the iron enhanced sand filter removal estimate also accounting for the associated extended detention treatment, or just the filter itself? Extended detention treatment. Sean, could you explain what you mean by that? I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah. I was just a point of clarification for me. We build the iron enhanced sand filters with a extended detention pond itself, which does some treatment in itself with settling.
Okay.
And I'm just curious if you're making the assumption that, on the iron enhanced sand filter that I just want to be sure that the removal rates are applied to the whole system of the iron enhanced sand filter, which includes the extended detention, instead of just the filtration effect.
Yeah, I think my answer to that would be probably is not. I'm pretty sure the answer is no, it's not including anything other than just the sand filter. So if you have some additional feature built into it, you probably would want to account for that in some fashion, either modeling that separately or adding it to the removal efficiency or something along those lines.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep. Would alum treatments be entered into section 2 to adjust the loading? If these would be alum treatments in a constructed basin or something, I assume, if that's true, if that's correct, then you could do it there, or you could bump up the treatment efficiency in sections 3 or 4, section 3. Does that answer your question, Pat?
Yeah, Mike, it would be for either iron or alum treatments in ponds or also in lakes.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, you could do it in either section 2 where you adjust your loads, or if you did it in a pond or a wetland, you could do it in section 3 by modifying your removal efficiency. Randy, it seems as though any situation that has anything the least bit unusual calls for the modeler to use the estimator creatively and use their judgment to make changes. Would you agree with this statement? Yes, I would. It's that simple in the estimator. We could certainly make this thing, somebody smarter than me could certainly make this a much more comprehensive tool. And then we would have to rename it something else because it would no longer be the simple estimator. It does require quite a bit of creativity in some situations. Maybe this is a good time to interject that if folks have ideas or situations that you come across, we could build a FAQ section, a page in the manual for the estimator and try to answer those. So I can actually take some of these questions from the chat box and start building an FAQ section in the manual. And if anybody has questions, they can email me those questions and I can put those in the FAQ section. Could you talk through an example of treatment by an inline regional pond after runoff in the upstream catchment is already treated by other BMPs like biofiltration? I understand modeling these in separate areas, but how do you determine the inputs for the regional pond after treatment? Actually, that I addressed that in the example that I showed earlier in the manual. Again, I'm thinking off the top of my head, which is always dangerous. One way that you might be able to model this is, I'm going to go back here. So if I understand the question correctly, I keep pointing over end. I don't want to end. One way to deal with it possibly is to put in a land use here that would be called treated, whatever you want to call it, treated blah, blah, blah. And so you have 5 acres of upland area coming into here that's been treated. You can put that 5 acres in and you can give it a new event mean concentration. The estimator's is not ideal for treatment trains. And so I understand that, but this might be one way of dealing with it. If other folks have ideas, certainly send those to me, or if you have an idea now how to deal with it, you can certainly chime in, but that might be one way of dealing with it. Not a question, but a statement. I found it essential for the previous version to build a document and log any changes, adaptations. This also provides it. That's a good point. And we do have that notes page now in as a separate tab. And so you can put your notes there if you want. Always save it. And when you save it, I would date it. And it may be that you may have a couple, you may want to create a new version of this and you might want to have that original file to go back to. So yeah, we do have that notes page now, which should help with that a little bit, but certainly save multiple copies. If the TMDL waste load for allocation has units in tons, how would we determine compliance based on % reduction of total loading? Yeah, TMDLs, it'd be nice if they all gave everything in the same units. A couple options here. Yeah, you could go to just simple % reduction. You could also convert your tons per day to pounds per acre per year if you wanted to do that. So yeah, you could convert it to units that are more amenable to use in the estimator, or you could just simply go with a % reduction. I don't see any more questions right now. So real quickly, I'm going to go back to share. Like I said, I can hang on longer here. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint.
I do have one question, Mike, just so I'm understanding. In regards to transportation, transportation is just the acres of highway and major highways. So, and residential kind of intertwines residential streets into it, correct?
Yeah, let me go to the manual real quickly here. And if everybody can hang on for just a second, please. We have these pages of NME concentrations for phosphorus or CSS. If you go down, so this page is talking about NME concentrations for phosphorus. But if you go down on this page, you'll see recommended NME concentrations by land use. So residential land use. And so we give a definition here of what residential land use is. Go down to transportation. This land use includes major transportation corridors where the land use is exclusively transportation. Typically highly impervious, may include only small vegetated areas consisting of swales or medians, relatively small right-of-ways. Does not include arterial streets in residential, commercial, industrial areas. Those should go in those areas instead. Hopefully that answers that question. So I've already talked about some of this. Limitations and considerations. The tool cannot route between BMPs and not easily. For those of you who are really into modeling and really savvy about this stuff, you can certainly come up with good solutions, much more creative than me. If you're not real comfortable with that, break your system down as much as possible to avoid having to work with treatment train adjustments. It's designed primarily for TMDL compliance. It's not really designed for system modeling. Use XP-SWIM or P8 for that instead. And again, just pointing out, consider how you break down the areas being addressed. That's really important on the front end. Don't just jump into the estimator and start using it. Really think about your system. I'm going to come back to this links page because we're going to probably start to lose some folks. But in the chat box, please indicate if you are interested in training for the estimator. The training would be you doing the work, not me. So if you're interested in training, please put in the chat box that you're interested. You don't need to write anything other than interested in training, because I just want to do a head count. The training probably would be something on the order of 6 to 8 to 10 at the most people per session, because having training with 30 people is not really practical, especially if it's going to have to be done online. So there's all these links in the manual. I'm going to go to this one here for starters, at least. So if you go to this page, guidance and examples for using the MPCA estimator, you'll see that there's an overview of it on the right. You can download the estimator here. There is a guidance video, which is basically what I've just been talking about during this session. You can download it as a PDF if you want. You can download the old version, version 2, which only has one area tab if you want to. There's a quick guide. This page has general description of the estimator. It talks about the different tabs. It talks about section 1, which I talked about, sections 2 and 3, section 4, somewhere here. And then way at the bottom, there's some tips for how to use it, addressing how can you address treatment trains, how can you adjust your event mean concentration, How can you adjust the fraction of water infiltrated? How do you adjust pollutant removal fractions? How do you address BMPs not included in the estimator? How do you adjust for impervious surface? Example 1, multiple subwatersheds. And example 2, treatment trains, non-structural practices, and other. So I've tried to cover, I think, most of the things that have come up, but I'm sure there's plenty of other. I'm going to go back real quick to see if there are any more questions that have popped up. What will the MPCA want for explanations and submittals? Must the permittee provide detailed explanations for every? Short answer to this is no, but Randy, as usual, when I put together guidance, the first person that I think about is, what question could Randy possibly ask? And so MPCA review of submittals using the we actually have a page on that. And so MPCA anticipates blah, 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 and reviewing information, MPCA staff will focus on the following. So gotcha on that one, Randy. But I'm sure you'll come up with something else that I haven't thought of. Did I share screen and show that? I don't think I did.
No.
Sorry. Let me do that real quick. MPCA review of submittals using the MPCA simple estimator. We do have a page in there on what we probably would be interested in looking at. Questions. Could you provide a guess about how different pages related to using the estimator are in the
Sorry, that should have been how many different pages?
Okay. You know what I think I might do is just create a page called the MPCA Simple Estimator. And on that page, I will provide links to all of the pages that address the estimator. Does that get at your question? There are probably about a half a dozen pages in the manual right now that deal with this, the estimator.
Yes, that answers the question. And I found a bunch more than just a half dozen.
Oh, probably, yeah.
But it depends on how you define related to the estimator.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, there is one page that a lot of you may be interested in. So Randy and I chatted several months ago, and Randy said, you know, it'd be nice if there were some canned scenarios showing default TSS and TP loads. Well, we did that exercise. Randy sent me a whole bunch of land use information. And so we developed 3 different scenarios for base loading of TSS and total phosphorus from 3 different types of areas. Area 1 would be areas that are built out already. So example would be St. Paul. Group 2 would be areas that are largely built out, but recently, Woodbury might be an example. Group 3 would be areas that are still developing. Chaska would be an area. So we ran the default scenario and came up with default loading rates for those. And we have those files here, those spreadsheets. The analysis, this summarizes the analysis for those 3 different areas and how we came up with those values in the estimator. There's a whole bunch of different information supporting that. So some folks may just simply be interested in using those default values.
Mike, I've got a question for you on that.
Yes, sir.
For group 2 and group 3, the TSS default values, this is with no BMPs in place. The default values are already below the target loading rate for the South Metro Mississippi River TSS TMDL.
That is correct.
Okay. So
I'm not-
essentially a submittal citing these default values for cities that fall into that category could do the job in terms of meeting the South Metro TMDL.
One would think that that might be a logical conclusion. I'm being a bureaucrat here, Randy.
Fair enough. MCSC will pose that question in a more official manner to folks that are higher up in the food chain.
I suspect that might be the case. Yeah. Now those are a word of maybe a word of caution. Those are default values, and yes, they're in there. Obviously, you may want to take a look at your if you're using that to claim that you're meeting the TSS South Metro. You may want to go into those files and make sure that all the assumptions are actually fairly correct for your system. It's based on the land use information that Randy sent me that Met Council has. It could be, I don't think you just want to apply them blindly. If your area, so the default, it has default percentages for ag land and default percentages for commercial land and so forth and so on. So you at a minimum, you would probably want to go in and make sure that those acreages, just that acreage distribution for your city is reasonable. If that makes sense. Let me go back. So my contact information is here, but I will stop sharing and see if any other questions have come up. No other questions. Anybody have anything, any comments, any questions? Does this seem like a tool that might be of value to folks? Seems like a lot of folks are interested in training. I'll go back and repost my contact information here, and not hearing any additional questions, maybe I'll leave the chat box open for 3 more minutes till 10:15, or somebody can jump in with a question. But if nothing pops up by 10:15, I'll probably sign out, and I appreciate everybody jumping in. I'll convert this to YouTube, this video, and put it in the manual. I'll create that page in the manual that I said I was going to create for where all that links to all the files, all the pages in the manual that deal with the estimator. I'll go back through the chat box and I'll create a FAQ page. And I'll get all this done by this afternoon, of course. So I'm just going to leave this page here like this. If you have a question, go ahead and ask it rather than put it in the chat box, because I don't see the chat box right now.
Hi, Mike. I have a quick question. This is my first time looking at this estimator, so might be an easy answer, but for sections 3 and 4, with the phosphorus and TSS, you're entering your acreage. Should those numbers be that you're entering be the same in both of those sections in most cases? Because you're the same BMPs.
Yep, that's a good point. In most cases, that will be the case, is that those acreages will be the same, because most BMPs are going to be obviously treating both pollutants. So yeah,
Okay.
thanks for making that point. I only did the phosphorus for simplicity's sake, but ideally, if you have 1 acre of bioretention, you'll want to treat both phosphorus and TSS and enter it in both those sections.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Mike, it looks like Chase Vanderbilt is asking a question about a previous question about the inline regional pond treatment.
Let me go back here. Could you talk through an example of treatment by an inline regional pond after runoff in the upstream catchment is already treatment? Okay, that was similar to the question that Justine asked before, I think. Again, we don't have pat answers to these questions. It's a little bit of artwork, I think. One option that the one that I mentioned to Justine, I think, was what you could do is create a new land use called treated, and that might be the acreage that's coming from that regional pond. Another option would be to treat that upstream area in one worksheet and then treat just the area draining to the regional pond in a separate worksheet. Those are the only two that I can really think of offhand. Two options. There might be other options. I can't think of any right now. Oh, I see Jay said I already answered it, but okay. Well, that is it for me. I appreciate everybody being here and have a great day, and maybe we'll see you soon in training.